Hey folks, welcome back to another one of our YouTube lives. Tonight we have Austin from Trees for Graziers. So Austin, he started Trees for Graziers to help farmers in Pennsylvania and beyond to achieve their shade, fodder, shelter, and fertility goals in their silvopasture systems. His goal is to make silvopastures as easy and cost-effective as possible for farmers. They offer everything from planning and funding acquisition to planting and aftercare, while also growing silvo-specific nursery stock. So if folks want to check out their Austin's website, it's fantastic. It's treesforgraziers.com. It's all the links for his websites, all his YouTube channels, his socials. They're all in the description box below this video. I highly recommend. He's got some fantastic articles. He's also got a great little ebook in his product section, which is how I found you years ago. I think it was probably three years ago. I was doing some work for a client and doing some research and stumbled across this. And honestly, man, it's, I think, one of the best kind of just, it's a great summary, but also goes into pretty good depth of some great silvopasture systems. So anyways, thanks so much for coming on our YouTube live. I'm personally just super jazzed about having you on. To kick things off, why don't you tell us a bit about what silvopasture is and why people, homesteaders, small scale farmers, and even large scale farmers should be interested in it?
You bet. And do you want me to start the presentation with that, since that's my first slide, or just?
Yeah, let's give her, man.
Let's jump into that.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to put her in presenter mode there.
You good right there?
Okay.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay, let's start. Let's get rolling with this. First off, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with folks. This is my passion, silvopasture, and specifically being able to help folks with getting trees integrated onto their properties for livestock. We'll get into more of that. So let's start off with the definition of silvopasture to start with. So silvopasture is pretty simple. So it's the intentional integration of forages, livestock, and trees. Those are the three key ingredients that you need. But those three ingredients can be combined in a whole bunch of different ways. There's millions of ways that those three ingredients can be combined. And it all really depends on your context, your goals, what you're after. There's two main ways to develop a silvopasture. One is to take an existing woods or a forest or thicket and thin that in order to create this kind of savanna landscape. And the other way is to take this open landscape and then plant trees into that. For record, we at Trees for Graziers, our most experience has been in planting trees into pastures. We're based in southeastern Pennsylvania, where we're in Lancaster County, and if anyone's familiar with that, it's a very rich agricultural area, a whole bunch of small farms in our area, small dairies in particular. This land has been intensively farmed for over 200 years, and there's not much in the way of trees remaining. There's definitely not areas that are just allowed to grow up into woods. Land here costs $30,000 to $50,000 per acre, so everything is utilized to the maximum. Wow. So for the most part, we're working with open pastures, and then we're integrating trees into those open pastures. So there's a number of ways that silvopasture has been applied both in the United States and elsewhere. Let me say North America in this case, and elsewhere around the world and throughout different times of history. So the most common form of silvopasture, to my understanding, in North America is pine and timber silvopasture. And this is particularly in the American Southeast, where pine plantations are common. And they've figured out that by integrating livestock in those pine plantations, they can get better return on their investment. So you have a long time to wait until those pine plantations mature. And while those pine plantations are growing, you can get annual income off of beef in particular. So that's a fairly common silvopasture type. At least that's what is portrayed. It's probably the most common of silvopasture, but that's not saying a whole lot because silvopasture as a practice is not very common. I was talking to a pine plantation person not too long ago who's been in the business for 20 plus years, and he said he's only ever seen a couple very, very small pine silvopasture plantings. So they're probably not all that widespread. And then the most widespread and most well-known practice that I'm aware of is the Spanish dehesa. And then it's also in Portugal, it's all called montado. And this is a practice that's literally covers millions and millions of acres. And this is kind of what it looks like. So it's these oaks, particularly two different types of oaks. There's one that's for cork, and one that is specifically for the acorns. So it's these two types of oaks, and then those support hogs in particular. The Iberian hog, which gets Iberian ham, which is some of the most expensive meat in the world. And then they also support the ruminants, so the cattle and the sheep that roam throughout the dehesa. So that's a very large system, a very widespread practice in Spain and Portugal. New Zealand has also done a lot to develop silvopasture, and there it's largely it started as a means of reducing erosion. So New Zealand, you can picture rolling hills, and if sheep are grazing that, they graze that, the forage is down to just about nothing all the time, right? And then what you get is these slips, these land slips. So there's almost no roots holding the soil together. And so when it rains, you get these big, it's not mudslides, but think of a mudslide with a little layer of grass on top. And so this whole sides of the mountain just like slide on down. And what they've found is that by establishing trees, in particular willows and poplars, they're able to hold that soil together in a way that they can't otherwise, at least not with drastic changes to their management. So in that case, establishing trees is just easier. And then the farmers in the meantime have figured out, hey, these trees can be a valuable source of fodder. They're obviously providing shade. The fodder from these trees can get us through drought periods. So there's the trees that were, my understanding was mostly brought in for ecological reasons and for land stabilization, have become more multi-purpose in their usage. And then, of course, we have a savanna, and that's often what we're looking to create in a silvopasture system, is this kind of widespread trees dotted throughout the landscape. So that's kind of the picture that we can have when looking to create a silvopasture. In general, I'd say that there's two main paths that we can think about when looking at silvopasture. Now, you can do both of these at the same time, but it's helpful to think of it as two options. One is to add trees that are there to support, or to add new food enterprises. So growing chestnuts, growing hickories for oil, growing hazelnuts, growing apples for cider, that kind of thing. So new tree crop enterprises for your farm. And then the other route that you can take is to mostly integrate trees that are there to support your existing livestock operation or future livestock enterprises. And your goal there really is to give greater comfort to your livestock. So greater comfort, well-being, reduce heat stress, reduce cold stress, and then to reduce your feed costs. Those are generally the two main ones. So provide feed during the summer when there's summer slump, provide mast crops. So that's kind of the two ways that I look at it. Mostly we work with farmers to really support their livestock operation. We don't get into tree crops necessarily, not much at least, because those are more complex. You have to figure out the marketing. You have to figure out how to harvest and process, and then market those tree crops that you grow. And we find that most farmers are too busy as it is. And I'm not confident enough in the long-term stability and profitability of a lot of these tree crops to be able to advise people on those. Whereas if we can take an existing livestock enterprise, let's say a dairy, and increase the efficiency of that dairy by reducing the heat stress for those livestock, and we're also reducing the feed cost for their livestock, then we know that a dairy that was, let's say it was marginally profitable before, can be that much more profitable through the integration of those trees. So it's a fairly simple means of integrating trees, and it doesn't add new business complexity. So in particular with ruminants, because that's the type of livestock that we've worked with the most to date, we're looking at providing shade and shelter, and then feed during critical times of the year. And then there's additional soil and ecosystem benefits that we're after with the trees as well. And we'll dive into those. So shade, everyone now in Alberta, this might be a little bit different, but in our area, again, southeastern Pennsylvania, we're in zone 7. Summers are 90 degrees and humid. There's real value to shade. So, and that's what brings most of our clients to us, is they recognize kind of viscerally the need for shade. I was outside today, it was sunny, humid, and 82 degrees. And I knew that that shade was needed. And so it's quite obvious that livestock do as well. A couple of things with shade. One is we want to have a canopy that is high up on the tree. So in this picture, and this is one of my favorite pictures of silvopasture, you can see that those sheep are about as far as can be from those rows of trees. So, and that's because the shade that those trees are casting, it moves a lot throughout the course of the day because the canopy is really high up on those trees. So oftentimes what we see is that a tree planted in a pasture has a really, really wide canopy, and it branches at, say, 5-6 feet off the ground. And what happens then is that the shade from that tree is right underneath the tree all day long. And then the livestock are right underneath the tree all day long. And so then that causes compaction. There's extra nutrients that are being deposited right there. And more times than not, the trees die because of the stress from all those livestock and the compaction. So that's not what we're after. We want the shade to move a lot throughout the course of the day so that livestock move throughout the course of the day. And then another thing that we would like to choose when we have the option is dappled shade. So we want a lot of sunlight to get through the canopy still to get to the forages beneath. And honey locust is one of the best for that. You can see that it's not a very dense shade. A lot of light is still getting through to the forages, and so that we can maximize our forage production. It's pretty clear that livestock generally they will take shade whenever they can get it. I was out at a farm in Virginia here recently, and I think it was right around 70 degrees. It was a cloudy day, and still all the cows on the neighboring farm were in the shade of this one tree, right? And so even on what would be considered cool days, livestock still like shade. So that's a fairly simple thing that we can offer livestock. Another thing is shelter, and this would be more of a factor in the colder regions that you guys are familiar with. So reducing cold stress, it's particularly valuable for protecting young animals. My understanding is that in Ireland, the main reason for silvopasture, or one of the biggest drivers of silvopasture, is providing protection for lambs soon after they're born, because any amount of cold and winds and rain can be seriously harmful to them and cause really high mortality rates. Conifers, we don't use a whole lot of conifers in our area because they really only do one thing. And most of our projects, we want to have windbreaks that provide other functions as well. And in our area, windbreaks just aren't as valuable or as necessary as shade. But the further north you go, the more valuable the windbreak aspect becomes, and the more you'll want to look at a really, really solid species for windbreaks. So conifers really do come in handy. We experienced a pretty significant summer slump in our area, and then also droughts. Thankfully, we're in an area ourselves that often gets skipped by drought, but it's very common not too far away from us where areas get hit pretty hard by droughts, and I'm sure it will come to us as well before too long. So we can plan, and we can plant ahead for summer fodder that's going to be there to reduce our dependency on bought feed, on hay, when the summer slump or when the drought occurs. So this is a picture of a number of sheep at Steve Gabriel's farm. Steve Gabriel is the author of the book Silvopasture, and I had the pleasure of visiting his farm a number of years ago and getting to feed some of his sheep. These are black locust leaves, and his story goes back to he kind of got into silvopasture because his area was hit really, really hard by a drought. He lives in upstate New York, and it was the brushy, overgrown areas on his farm that were able to get him through the drought period, because he was just able to systematically start thinning those brushy areas and feeding his sheep with that. Because even in the middle of one of the worst droughts that they had seen, the shrubs, the trees still had green leaves and were still accessing moisture because they're just so resilient. They have deep root systems. So I like to think of those as kind of a bank of fodder, an insurance system that we can fall back on. And then one of the main things that we look into here in our area is, can we use trees to drop stored energy, high energy feed late in the season? So the two main species that we use for that are honey locust and persimmon. Honey locust is about as good as it comes for silvopasture, because it has both that dappled shade, it can fix nitrogen, and it also has a high energy pod that it drops in November, December, January into February, which is just the time of year when livestock need that extra feed energy. And then persimmon is similar. Depending on the cultivar, it can drop as early as August or September, and then all the way into January, February, March, and some will even hang on beyond that. So they're a great source of feed energy at a time of year when it's really valuable. What I love about this is, as forages are collecting solar energy throughout the year and turning it into more grass, what these trees are doing, whether it's honey locust or persimmons, mulberries, apples, whatever it is, what they are doing is they're taking this solar energy and they're converting it into actual feed energy or sugar. What the tree is looking to do is they're looking to encapsulate their seed in this nice sweet treat for animals. And what we can do through our interaction and selection of these trees is harness them to provide that feed energy that we need for our livestock, and provide it in a different package than we can with just forages. Some of the other things that we look at is being able to provide tannins and other micronutrients for livestock. Tannins are just one example, because they have a number of different functions, like being anti-parasitic, and they help with protein use and reduce methane. And one interesting thing is that they might be able to help livestock be able to make good use of things like toxic fescue and reed canary grass. So, and toxic fescue in particular is a really large problem in so much of our area, and then what they call the fescue belt, which is mostly south of us and to the west. So that's just one of the things that we're looking at, as well as some of those micronutrient interactions and livestock just having access to other micronutrients that they can't access in their forages already. And then we just want to see more biology on these farms, really, is we want to see more fungal interactions. We want to see more nitrogen fixation happening. We want to see just more like larger plants coming into this ecosystem, woody plants coming into this ecosystem, which are creating structure, which are creating habitat for all kinds of different microorganisms, and then also larger wildlife. So there's a lot of things going on here that we can create by adding this new level and layer of silvopasture. I've mentioned that most of our work to date has been with ruminants. So we're in dairy country, where we have, I'd say 80% of our clients are dairies, if not more. So that's the main work that we do because of our geography. And we've done almost all of our work within 2 hours. So we've worked with about 45 farms to date, where we've done the plan, we've done everything from planning the project to implementing and doing the planting and doing the maintenance afterwards, and that's all within about 2 hours of where our site is, and those are all active farms. So one of the things that we're looking to move into in the years ahead is providing feed, in particular for hogs and poultry. And I think there's a lot of upside. I'm convinced that there's a lot of upside to integrating trees in hog and poultry systems. And that's because neither of them are ruminants, right? So they are monogastric livestock. They have one stomach, just like we do. And so they're not able to take in forages as the bulk of their diet. They are, even if people have pigs on pasture, for the most part, the bulk of their feed is coming from grain, right? And so we can, through the integration of the right kinds of trees, provide the kind of feed, whether that's mulberries or persimmons or acorns, or chestnuts, or for hogs, it's a whole big list of things that we can provide for them that are going to cut into the feed bills. And your number one input in these systems is grain, is the feed cost. So if we can provide some of the feed that's grown right there on the farm, and substantially reduce those feed costs, what I want to see is I want to see livestock operations that are raising hogs and poultry on pasture having a real financial leg up compared to confinement operations that are having to buy in all of their stuff, all of their feed. If we can really cut into the feed costs for pigs and poultry, that to me is going to be a real game changer, and a place where silvopasture can make really, really significant contributions. And so both poultry, the chickens that we have now, they weren't domesticated from prairie chickens, right? These are domesticated jungle fowl. They want to be in the woods. They want to be in areas where they can get shelter. So whether it's shrubs or trees, and shrubs are that's their ideal. That's where they want to be and feel the most secure. And then similarly, hogs that are domesticated from wild boars. So their natural environment is a woodland. And so I think the idea of pastured poultry or pastured pigs doesn't go far enough. It does a great job in improving animal welfare, and it gets livestock out of confinement operations, which are just terrible. But we need to go a step further, or a couple steps further, and that really involves the integration of the kind of ecosystems that these animals need, and that will also be providing the feed and the shelter that these animals need. And I think that will turn into more profitable, more ecologically sound systems for us as well on our farms. So a number of things that we can look at for income diversification. and then homestead resiliency. One thing that we tell farmers, our clients, is even if you're not going to sell some of these tree crops, at least plant some for your own home use, because that gives you and your family more resiliency. So whether that's chestnuts as a stable crop, yellow bud hickory is an interesting one. You can press it for an oil that's similar to an olive oil. Heart nuts are really nice. They're kind of a walnut. They're related to walnuts, but they're easier to crack. I have a number of them myself, and they're really nice for homestead use. Cider, obviously, apples are our number one fruit that everyone loves to grow, and there's all kinds of great uses for it. Being able to grow your own timber or your own firewood is very valuable, and we help a lot of our clients integrate trees for that purpose. A lot of folks are also driven by hunting, being able to integrate trees that are going to draw wildlife in at certain periods of the year, and be able to support a larger population of wildlife. And overall, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create more resiliency and stability for the farm, for the homestead, and ultimately for our farming communities. So one question that is often raised is this really something that is for real, serious, professional farmers, or is this just for tree huggers, for hippies? And I say this is absolutely something that makes sense for actual farms. And going back to our clients, we have not worked with any homesteaders at this point. Most homesteaders get priced out of our area, unfortunately, because of the high cost of land. All of our clients that we've worked with are full-time farms, where this is what they're doing professionally, and this is what they're choosing to do in terms of integrating trees for financial reasons. So one example is if you break down some of the math, and I have an article on my website getting deeper into the numbers here. Around our area, you can expect maybe $150 to $200 per head per year in an additional profit just on weight gain alone. That's pretty significant right there. And it's likely to be even better because the research that was done, that we're drawing from at the University of Kentucky, that was done with artificial shade. And time again, studies show that trees are able to provide better, more pleasant, more comfortable shade than even artificial shade shelters are. So I think that this is probably a conservative estimate, and that makes a very significant contribution to the bottom line. Reducing feed costs. So again, looking at my area where land is really expensive, and this applies to other areas as well, but to mine in particular, if you want to expand the farm, or if you want to increase your carrying capacity, let's say it that way. If you want to increase the carrying capacity of your farm, you could look at buying more acreage for $30,000 to $50,000 per acre. But that assumes that more acres are available, that it's in a place that is accessible to you. And you don't have to ship your livestock and load them up on a truck, and that creates all kinds of other costs. One thing that we can do, well, the downside of that is that land will be subject to the same spring flush of forages and same summer slump, and the same fact that over the winter months you're not producing any feed. So you're just creating more forages in our area during the spring, and you aren't really gaining a whole lot in the summer. And so by integrating tree crops, we can integrate trees that are going to address those periods of low feed availability, and we can do it for a fraction of the cost that it would be to add additional acreage. So for our summer months, we can add tree crops that are going to be there for fodder. And that is actually doing something very specifically about adding tree crop carrying capacity over the summer months. And again, for tree crops that are going to drop honey locust pods or persimmon fruit or apples or that kind of thing, that's doing something that is specifically going to address your lack of feed going into the winter months. So it can be a very economical decision to integrate these trees into our farm systems. So let me give one example here, just an economic breakdown. And this is a couple years old. I'm not sure what the current costs are of organic molasses, but if you want to compare apples to apples, in this case, we're going to compare sugar to sugar. This a couple years ago, I broke down the math, and it turned out that organic molasses would give you a pound of sugar for about 80 cents. So that's often used as a feed supplement to increase production in dairy cows and increase the palatability of food. And meanwhile, if you were to plant honey locust trees, this is a pretty conservative estimate, you'd be paying about 9 cents per pound of sugar. So 80 cents per pound with organic molasses, 9 cents per pound with honey locust trees. And then also from the honey locust, you're getting shade, you're getting nitrogen fixation, you're getting all kinds of other ecological benefits. And there's such a huge difference here because we've created by adding trees that are high quality, that are working with your ecosystem. We're developing these low input nature-based systems. So nobody has to annually seed, no one has to till, no one has to run tractors over the land, no one has to harvest it and run it off to a place to get processed. This is all based on trees that are there year in, year out. They're intercepting solar energy, and they're taking that energy and they're turning it into feed energy, and they're dropping it right there for livestock to consume right there. And very, very simple, resilient systems for our farms. One of the questions that I get frequently is, am I going to lose my forage production? And in our context, most of our forages are what we call cool season perennial forages. And those forages, as the name suggests, they grow the best during our cool season. And what we see with those is there's a little bit of a Goldilocks zone that we want for our silvopasture systems. So we know that if there's a full enclosed forest, full enclosed canopy, those forages won't grow, right? There's not enough sunlight available at the canopy or at the forest floor for forages to grow. So we don't want too much shade, but we also don't want too little, because these again are cool season forages, and they are going to get heat stressed if they have too much sunlight, especially in the middle of the summer. So what we want is, and this picture demonstrates it pretty well, is we want a scattered dappled shade that's going to improve our livestock performance, but is also going to improve the performance of our forages and reduce heat stress on our forages. From research that's been done, for example, at Virginia Tech, they've found that over the course of the year, you don't see a reduction in forages with a well-designed silvopasture that's not overstocked, right? And particularly valuable is you can see additional forages available in the summertime. And that's because, again, we're going back to this cool season forages. We're able to reduce heat stress on forages. And that's particularly valuable because summer is the time when we need forages the most. Spring, most people have way too much forage to go around and they can't keep up with it. And it's the summer months where more forages actually become significantly valuable. And one little anecdote here is that we've found that in drought conditions, the forages that seem to do the very best are those that get the morning shade from our trees. And what I think is happening is that those trees or those forages that get the morning shade are able to effectively make use of the dew that sets on them in the morning time. So that's one thing that we're observing as some of our tree systems get a little bit more mature, is that that our farms are becoming more resilient to drought because of those. So, in summary, what we're looking for in silvopasture is really to create resilience. We want to have resilience to too much heat and too much cold. We want to protect our farms from instances of too much rain, and so the trees are able to soak up that water and keep it on the landscape. And also, we want to protect ourselves against drought. We want to reduce our dependency on outside feed costs or outside imports of feed and other farm materials. And we also want to give people alternatives to feeling like, in order to expand production, that they have to go out and buy more land. And in buying more land, they're actually running into a lot of the same problems that they have on their existing piece of land. So we want to see folks be able to increase their carrying capacity on the land and also decrease their costs of running their operation. And then because of that, having a greater profit margin and able to have just more security on the farm or on the homestead. And really, this is all about figuring out how to use these plants that are out there, these trees and shrubs that haven't really been integrated into grazing systems yet, and figuring out how do we use these tools that have been in our toolbox all along, but we haven't ever learned how to use them. So this is the kind of scene that I'm glad to see, that people are figuring out how to do good rotational grazing. But this is what I really want to see. This is kind of the next step of grazing, is figuring out how to integrate those trees in a beneficial way. So getting into the nuts and bolts a little bit here, this is how we are protecting. So this is a little bit of our establishment methods for our trees. What we have developed is most of our plantings revolve around this a plantra tree shelter, and that's how we're protecting the trees from livestock. So it's a plastic tube with ventilation, as you can see, and then it has a fiberglass stake on the inside. And the value of the fiberglass stake is, one, it flexes, so it's able to withstand a little bit of rubbing and a little bit of wear and tear, and it also is not going to rot like an oak stake or another kind of wooden stake are very common in like conservation plantings, but they do have a tendency to rot off before you want them to break down. So we use a fiberglass stake. The other upside about those, the fiberglass stake and the plastic tube, a combination is everything is an electrical insulator. And that's very valuable to us because now if you're running sheep, you might not need this, but for cattle, 1,000-pound animal, that they would love nothing more than to rub up on these tree shelters. And so what we figured is that the shelter protects from browse, and the electricity, so that usually what we're using is just a single strand of polywire that's run along the row of trees. Or in this picture on the right, what we'll do is we'll run a single strand of polywire at 6 feet high, and that way livestock can move underneath the polywire and have free access anywhere that they want in the pasture. And then what we'll do, and this is not pictured in this photo, but what we'll do is we'll take some polywire or aluminum wire, and we will wrap that along here, along the polywire, and then we'll wrap that around the tube and affix it down towards the bottom of the tube. And so we're creating a spiral all along the outside of the tube, and the whole tube then is electrified. So that way, in that system, and that's becoming more and more common in our plantings, what goes on then is livestock have free access wherever they want, and you don't have to use those rows of trees as a paddock division. You can if you want to. It's a great option for some, but if you want to maintain flexibility, then this setup, what we call our overpass system, allows livestock a lot of flexibility and still protects those tubes. So you can integrate trees into your plantings with very little or no changes to the management of the farm. So that's worked out really well. And then this middle picture just shows how we really encourage people to go heavy on mulch. I like to say that a good mulching is the best watering that you can do for these plantings. We rarely have to water. We don't irrigate. We again are in a climate that allows that. We're in a fairly forgiving area, but one way or another, mulch is a fantastic way to go, and it's a great way to ensure that that those trees have adequate moisture in the initial months while they're getting established. And then in addition to moisture retention, they're also reducing the competition with other weeds, and they're creating a more fungal environment right around that tree while it gets established. So right here is a planting, a picture of one of our larger plantings. This was taken probably a year or two ago, and just gives you a little bit of an idea of what they can look like. You'll notice that here we've used barbed wire to protect these trees from cattle, and it's not something that we recommend on most of our sites, because we've also had instances where the barbed wire did not work. But this farm, the cows have very much respected these plantings and the tree tubes with the barbed wire. And we now have about 90 acres of silvopasture on this farm that we've done in multiple phases throughout the last 4 years. One thing that we help a lot of folks with is getting access to funding. Silvopasture is definitely a practice that can be done profitably, without a doubt. The trick is that it's profitable over a longer term time frame, right? So it's an upfront cost with a long-term return on investment, and so a lot of folks just don't have the time or the money to be able to invest in this and not get a return on their investment for 5 to 10 to 20 years. And so that's where it's very helpful to go after funding to reduce that investment cost. One thing, and this is going to be different in Canada and the United States, and every state is going to have different resources, and even localities are going to have different resources. We've had a lot of success working with local conservation groups, whether they be water quality conservation groups or folks who are working for climate change and carbon sequestration or whatever. But so there's going to be different resources available. One thing I just want to highlight, and we have an article about this on the website, is what I call the CSP strategy. So it's the Conservation Stewardship Program is what CSP stands for. And the Conservation Stewardship Program is with NRCS, and folks are able to tap into it fairly easy, especially if you worked with NRCS before and are doing a good job of conservation. And I think most of the people tuning into this are going to be in that category. So it's worthwhile having a conversation with your local NRCS to see if the Conservation Stewardship Program can be right for you. And even if you don't, even if your state does not support silvopasture, as Pennsylvania does not at this point support silvopasture through NRCS. Even if your state does not support silvopasture, you can always apply for other practices through the Conservation Stewardship Program, and then you can use the additional money, because everyone would get payments in the United States. At least it's been increased to a minimum annual payment of $4,000 per year over the course of a 5-year contract. So we're talking about $20,000 over the course of 5 years. And the practice that you choose could be anything as simple as doing pasture scoring, which really doesn't cost you any money. So you can take all of that extra money that you get above and beyond the cost of actually doing the practice and use it for whatever you want. And silvopasture is included there. So all that to say that there are some good options for getting funding, and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, is one that I think is simple to work with. Everyone that I've talked to about this has said that it's been very accessible, and it works very well for small farms, for homesteads, for projects that are not all that big, and then it gives you a lot of flexibility. And then if you're not able to make something work, what I tell people is start now and start small. And especially in the first year or two, while you're getting trees established, don't go break the bank. Don't spend a whole bunch of money on fancy trees. Start with just like 10 trees. Play around with them. See if you can get them established with your livestock. If you can't, and also choose black locust or willows or poplars or trees that are just really, really easy to work with, that are going to be forgiving. And if you can get those trees established, that's a great first start. And because most people don't have experience getting trees established in a pasture, and it's not rocket science. But at the same time, we don't want to put too much money or too much effort into it the first time around, if you haven't done it before, and then just slowly start building from there, build out your confidence, and then see where you can take it from there. And then I think this is the last bit. So what we do is we provide the whole suite of services for folks, and like Takota shared in the beginning, in the intro, our goal really is to make it as simple as possible for farmers to say yes to silvopasture. I'm convinced that a lot of farmers actually want to do this. There's very little silvopasture happening in the United States at this point, but I am very confident that there's a whole bunch of farmers that would love nothing more than to integrate trees into their pastures, but they just don't have the time, the energy, the effort, the time, the energy, the money to put in this kind of effort and investment that they know is not going to pay off for at least 5 years. Farms just don't have the extra bandwidth and the extra finances to do this for the most part. So what we do is we come in and we make it easy for folks by helping out with the planning. We get access to funding. We have our own nursery that's silvopasture specific, so we're growing a lot of silvopasture tree species. We'll do the planting. We have a planting crew that's just wrapping up with our spring planting right now. And then we do the aftercare. So we provide maintenance after those trees are planted. And what we want to do is we want this model, this full service model, to expand, because we can only do it for so many people. And the farther we go from our base right here, the more expensive and the more challenging it gets. So what I want to see is other businesses and services, whether that's a for-profit or a nonprofit organization, being able to provide this same suite of services to farms to make it simple for them. I want every county in the United States and everywhere in Canada to have access to, if you want silvopasture, I want everyone to have access to someone locally that can help them. So one thing that we're doing, and if you want more information about this, it's on our website, is we're doing this training called Silvo Pro, where we are training people to take this service model and adapt it to their own region. So that's one thing that I have for people is, if you're interested in doing this, it can actually be a business. So I started my business planting trees into pastures in 2017. 2017 is when I started planting trees for conservation purposes. And it was only in 2020 that we started planting into pastures. And then since then, we've grown to an organization with 8 full-time year-round team members, plus additional seasonal crew. So this really can be a significant business, or it can be something that's done on the side. We just need more people out there providing these services and support for farmers. So that's my plug here at the end. And I think now that wraps me up, and we'll move on over to the Q&A.
That was fantastic, Austin. Thanks so much for that. I made a couple notes here that just to kind of provide a bit more context for the Western Canada context. So that there has been research that's shown, having shelter belts in the wintertime here can reduce like feed costs by 20%. And I loved the point you made about the price per acre kind of investment versus purchase. And it's something that I try to, it's a paradigm shift that I try to get my clients to look at too, is like, yeah, rather than spending, $5, 10, 20, $30,000 per acre of land, why not invest a fraction of that per acre? Like, can you imagine if someone put, even $1,000 per acre in fencing and water systems, in tree systems, in soil health improvements, in pasture seed, like it would be the yield. You could probably double the yield depending on where your baseline is, and it'd be easier to manage. It's such a great point.
That's another very real thing, is the more land that you buy, the more spread out you get, the more that you managing 100 acres is significantly more challenging than managing 50. Yes,
absolutely. And like the if you want like mathematical proof of that, the area of a circle is an exponential function, right? And so for it really doesn't, it's hard for people to set in, but it's so true. And this is why one of the concepts in permaculture is this idea of zones, which is where you put, the further you go away from your center of operation, the harder it is for you to manage them. The other thing I wanted to just really highlight is, so you were talking about this idea of the summer slump. And so this is an image. I hope you don't mind. I'm giving a bit of a teaser for your book here. So this is a fantastic image you've got from your Grazier's Guide to Trees here. Can you just explain what you mean by the summer slump, and then how the integrating tree crops into that can address that?
Yeah. So this is something that we see in at least most of the Eastern United States. And this is the context that I'm familiar with. So right now we're in the middle of May. We have a lot of forages. Everything is growing really well. It's super lush. It's super green. This is peak time for forage availability, right? People they just can't keep up with all the forages that are out there. So this is a great time to be a grazier. But then come July, August, it's not such a great time to be a grazier, because whether it's a drought or just the heat is stressing these cool season forages. And consistently year over year, you see a summer slump. So there's a time of poor forage production on most farms. And this is particularly on farms that are supported by perennial cool season forages that aren't integrating annuals. So a common way to address this is by planting warm season annuals. And that's, a lot of farmers do that, but then that's specialized equipment and it's significant work, and you have to time it right. So a lot of farms just choose we're gonna just stick with the cool season perennials as our base, and then you deal with that summer slump and that really strong curve of production. And then of course during the wintertime, there's nothing being produced. And so depending on how you stack this, and in New Zealand, it seems like they've gone really heavy towards tree fodder for addressing that summer slump. You can really provide a lot of forages during those summer months. Willows and poplars are the two most commonly used. Mulberry would be another fantastic one. And all of these trees just have really, really deep and extensive root systems, and they're able to stay green and lush and vibrant even through the most significant of droughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And the piece that I wanted to highlight here too is by adding trees in, as you've shown, like it'll actually even this out more. Like you'll start to get grass earlier in the year. Like even in our area in Alberta, we're like a zone 3, 4. We still see the earliest, the places where the grass greens up and grows the most in our early springs is under tree cover. Yep. And the place that stays greenest longest is in the fall. And the other piece is by having it, shaded. I mean, it not only does it shade the cows, it shades the pasture, which improves reduces the evaporation, but it also stops plants from bolting. Most plants can't photosynthesize, above a certain temperature range. And so when they get too hot, they get stressed, they produce seed, which reduces palatability. And so, like the trees and pastures and cows were just, or any animals were just made for each other. And this is probably one of my favorite kind of, graphs or images from your book that just really hits home how critical these integrations are on whether it's a small scale homestead and for sure on a farm is where this really starts to pay off. Like for 30 years, before we even heard of the term silvopasture, we always reserved. We have a couple paddocks on our farm where there's existing trees, and we always reserve those for our kind of mid-season slump when it's really hot, the cows don't like it. We get into a drought. We would always save those pastures for then, so we could throw the cows into the trees there to give them a bit of shelter. But yeah, now we're actually deliberately adding these species in.
Yeah, and I could say too that silvopasture might make even more financial sense for homesteads because they're buying everything at retail cost, right? So a commercial farm is buying at a fairly large discount, right? They're able to buy their feed in bulk. They're able to buy their hay in bulk. They have large equipment to do a lot of this stuff, like moving heavy bulking material. Most homesteads don't have that, and they're buying their feed in small amounts. So if you're going to Tractor Supply or whatever your local equivalent is to buy your feed, you're paying retail prices for it. Whereas someone who's running a CAFO, they're getting the biggest discount that you can get. Yeah. So any amount of feed that you can offset is going to make so much more difference in your system on a small scale than it is for a larger producer. And it's probably going to be easier for you to integrate as a homesteader because it's going to take, you have the bandwidth and the ability to just customize things more in a homestead scenario than someone might in a larger farm scenario where they might be already boxed into certain means of production.
Absolutely. That's such a great point there. Yeah. Do you have any experience with Caragana arborensis or like Siberian pea shrub?
I don't. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but we're in an area where we're fairly warm and humid, and I've never thought that Siberian pea shrub would really thrive in our area. So I've never really messed around with it too much. Plus, we haven't worked with too many sheep or goat producers yet, and that's the kind of thing that I would love to use with those kind of livestock.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it would either, like, my gut is it would probably take over. It would be super aggressive in your area. It does tolerate droughts really well, but that's probably one of the ones like in Western Canada where most people are. If you throw a rock, you'll hit a Caragana shelter belt that was planted, 100 years ago. And it really is like, I just go grab some, feed some to we feed the seeds to our chickens. Our dairy cows love eating the leaves, even though it's thorny, they still pick through them. It's just such a fantastic plant, and it's readily available. Everyone hates it here. Like it's almost, it's literally what saved us from the Dust Bowl. And now it's in a lot of counties here. It's like, it's listed as an invasive species. Yeah. But it
sounds like autumn olive in our area.
Yeah, it'd be probably, it's not quite as thorny, and it's quite a bit shorter, and I think the leaves would be more palatable even.
Yeah, autumn olive does not have the palatable leaves, but it does have some pretty amazing fruits.
Okay, yeah, that's true. And then the other one, you're talking about oaks. Do you have any experience with bur oak?
A little bit. We haven't delved as much into the oaks
Okay.
as we have into honey locust, persimmon, and mulberry are the 3 species that we're doing the most with. I'd like to get into the oaks more, especially as we start to integrate with hogs.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And that's, I can't remember where I read it years ago. Maybe it was in the Tree Crops for Graziers, but it was the, an acre of oaks can produce as much carbohydrates as like an acre of barley or wheat.
Yeah.
And if they were pruned properly, you'd still get the grass underneath it too. It's like,
Yep. Yeah, the book Tree Crops has some really fascinating things to say about oak trees. One species that we're starting to use more is called swamp chestnut oak. It's native a little bit south of us, but hey, it's climate change, so it should be doing quite well with us. So swamp chestnut oak is also called cow oak, and my understanding is that that's because it tends to have very low tannin acorns. And so that's what we're kind of after, is the fairly large, very low tannin acorns.
Yeah. Well, that's why the reason I asked about bur oaks is because not only are they hardy to our area, but apparently they're the largest, sweetest acorn in the world.
Okay.
And I have seen guys grow them in the southern states. They get quite a bit larger down there. Like they're like the size of small apples.
Yeah.
Down there. Here, they only get that big, but they're we've been having really good success with them here, and that's one of our long-term strategies, is to run our pigs through burrow kind of silvopasture systems as well. But it's things grow so slow. so slow here. I know when you're showing pictures, I think you had a post recently. It was like you did 10 feet of growth in 1 year.
Well, we established 10-foot tall willows and poplars. So willow and poplar poles that were 10-foot tall live stakes, and getting trees established right away that way.
Okay, so that's what it was. Yeah,
exactly.
And that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Is I have never had a lot of success with live staking trees, and maybe it's just because we're so dry here. Like we only get 12 inches of rain a year if we're lucky. Wow. And so you're a lot whiter than ours. But can you? This blog just blew my mind of like just the possibilities of this. Can you talk to me a bit about the strategy? Are you doing anything? Are you doing any, root dipping or anything strategic? Or are you literally just cutting trees in the late winter and drilling holes in the ground?
That's it. Yep. And the moisture is a huge factor, right? If you've only got 12 inches of rain, that's, I'm sorry about that. But we've messed around with willows and poplars for quite a bit. No root dip, nothing for those species. And what you're right, the prime time to be taking those cuttings is like February, March. Before things really start to break bud is what we want to do while things are still fully dormant. And what you want to do is you want to just pick a location that's good and wet, ideally, for our willows in particular. And for our poplars, they can take more moderate soil. And in your case, where you are very limited in your moisture, I'd say just do a lot of mulch is probably the best bet. Especially if you're not able to do irrigation. And then we've pushed this. We're trying to see how far can we push live stakes. And I've taken live stakes that are up to 20 feet tall, just to see, can we do this? And my question really was, is there a limit to the amount of water that tree can translocate from the bottom, from its bottom all the way up to the top? Does it have enough capacity to move that water all the way up to 20 feet tall? So a couple years ago, I planted 3 20-foot tall live stakes. I chose my site well, so there was a nice wet area, and I mulched it really good. I hit rock like 18 inches down, so I wasn't able to go more than 18 inches, maybe 2 feet deep. But they were 18 foot above the soil line, and all 3 of them did really, really well.
Wow. And with no roots, that's incredible.
No roots. Yep.
Wow. So now, so you're literally just taking full trees. You just, trim all the branches off. You're not, and then are you, I think in this image here, are you going along, where did that go. Are you going along afterwards? And like, what's your pruning strategy that first year? Like, are you trying to keep the canopy quite small to minimize, evapotranspiration, or?
Yep. And that picture right there is the second season. So the second growing season in that case. No, I don't want to, like, the first year, I'm just going to let it go. And over time, if we want to manage it as a taller tree to provide quick shade, then I'll start to prune off some of the lower branches and prune it in such a way that we get a high canopy so that the shade moves a lot throughout the course of the day. If I want to manage it for fodder, then what I want to do is I want to start making my pollard head fairly early on. Most of our clients, I think, are going to want the trees to be a tall shade tree. Most are probably not going to be wanting to invest the labor in the fodder side of things. Again, they're mostly dairies. They have other means of feeding livestock. They've got hay. The cows are all going to the barn twice a day anyway, and so they're gonna, if they have a drought, they're just going to feed in the barn. And that's going to be different from someone who is raising cattle in a range scenario, especially like the larger the farm is, the further the livestock are from a central facility where there's a lot of easy means of feeding, then the more that being able to like chop and drop feed out in the pasture makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, enough with my questions. I'll go over to some of the ones that were pre-submitted here from our newsletter subscribers. Okay, there was a whole bunch around the best spacing, kind of between tree lanes to optimize pasture growth. So yeah, Tyson was asking about that. Alex also had a question: is there any reason why you can't push the distance between, in a food forest or in a silvopasture system, a bit further? And then I had some questions around that too, of like is there like a set distance, or does that change based on your sun angle? Like if you're designing a passive solar greenhouse, you have to take, the azimuth of your, winter and summer solstice into account. So can you just talk a bit about the strategy of between row and then in row spacing for your tree systems?
Yeah, I'll share what we've done for most of our projects. Not that that's the ideal in every context, but what we get into is we mostly are looking for easy accessibility for the farm, easy management. These are pretty simple silvopasture systems that we're putting in. Nothing crazy complex. I know we had talked about syntropic agroforestry a little bit before the call, and that gets into a lot more complexity than most of our systems. Most of our systems, again, are going into like existing dairy farms in particular. So they already have their infrastructure. They have their barn, they have their roads, they have their fences, they have all of that kind of set up. And we're figuring out with them how to integrate these trees in a way that's fairly simple to manage for their farms. So what we're looking to do in general is to create a fairly even spread of shade. So let's say someone wanted to plant trees in their pastures. If we had 100-foot spacing in between rows of trees, that's pretty wide. And what you're going to see is you're going to have livestock clustering underneath those rows of trees, and then they're going to be moving their nutrients and their impact under those pretty wide rows of trees. And we're going to get bands of impact and bands of no impact in the middle. And so most of our projects, let's say, are between 40 and 60-foot spacing in between rows of trees. And then in between trees in the row, we're mostly looking at, let's say, 15 to 30 feet spacing in between trees in the row. Those are kind of the most common parameters that we're working with in our context. So fairly widely spread out trees. I think a lot of scenarios people will go even lower, especially as we are able to roll out trees that are high quality genetics, where and like a tall tree. So when we're able to get to the point where we're bringing like a 6-foot tall high quality honey locust that's going to be there for the next 100 years, then we probably will do less with fast growing shade trees. Because right now we're doing a lot of systems where we plant every other tree as a fast growing shade tree, whether that's a black locust or a hybrid poplar or a hybrid willow that's there for shade, maybe fixing nitrogen in the case of black locust. But then we're going to probably take it out in 10 years or 15 years. And we're staggering those with our longer term species that are going to be there for the next 100 years. But as we get to the point where we're able to bring in a 6-foot tall tree that's able to provide shade in, let's say, 3 years, I think a lot of people will say, let's just not mess with the fast growing shade trees that have to thin in a couple of years. And let's just put kind of a more mature spacing, a wider spacing on those long-term trees. So that's what I'm anticipating us seeing in the years ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So like, just to think about that then is essentially it would be almost calculating your summer sun angles such that, wherever the position of the sun is in the sky, it's going to cast basically shade to the next row or almost there. Is that kind of what you're thinking about?
Not necessarily. What I'm thinking about more is I just want my shade to be fairly even. And I want like a smaller canopy tree. So persimmon is one that gets a fairly small canopy, let's say 20 feet wide, even as a mature tree. Whereas a maple tree, like a red maple, could get like a 50-foot wide, really, really dense canopy. And they're typically going to be just a couple, like 6 feet above the ground is where they branch out. So you have this really big, really wide tree. And instead we want a smaller canopy higher up off the ground. I haven't really thought about thought through the sun angle yet. Maybe I should sleep on that here tonight and think about it and come back to it.
Because I hadn't thought of that either, but like just from this image, you can basically see that like it's just perfectly set up. Now, I guess the other question I had with the trees is, do you typically try to orient your trees east-west then so that they provide more shade? Because or does it really matter in the summertime because the sun's kind of coming around? Like, do you have a preference for east-west orientation or north-south?
Not really. The more even the trees are, the less the orientation really matters. Because we don't have super strong rows one way or another. Now, if we were planting trees, let's say every 5 feet or every 10 feet, then it makes more difference than if we're planting our trees on what will probably eventually be like somewhere like a 30 by 40 grid or something like that.
Yeah, because I know a lot of the syntropic guys, they always talk about orienting north-south so that, you get full sunlight at midday all the way down the row, rather than, each kind of successive row shading each other. But that's a different context and a lot more dense. But,
a lot more density than most of our systems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Aaron's asking, what's the best way to dry and stockpile tree hay for winter feeding? Is it possible to feed solely tree hay through the winter without negatively affecting cattle or sheep?
The best resource that I've found on this is a book called Sproutlands. It's not a super technical resource, but it does have some like anecdotes and some stories about this. So Sproutlands, and they talk about a lot of Scandinavian cultures in particular that have used tree hay. And it sounds like they were often feeding like just tree hay throughout the course of the winter or using it as a major supplement. We haven't gotten into tree hay at all, really. I think for a modern context, especially on our mechanized farms, like it's just so much easier to make normal hay. It's so much easier, so much faster to make normal hay. Where I just don't think that it's going to be efficient use of labor to cut and dry and then stockpile tree hay. What I would look to for the most part is a chop and drop system where you're just dropping it right off the tree and the livestock are able to come and consume that right away during the summer months.
Yeah. although to echo your point, like in a homesteading context, when you're buying your feed, from someone else in small square bales or 50-pound bags, it may start to shift
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Okay, Tippy Acres here. Any suggestions about converting multiflora, ragweed, and mostly ash trees to livestock-friendly areas? Right now, we have 3 pigs rotating every 5 to 7 days, then seeding clover, radish, and peas. There's also I had kind of a similar question just around. You mentioned at the beginning of you can either plant trees into pasture or you can kind of make pasture
Mhm.
out of forest. And so could you talk a bit about some of the strategies there? Like, are you going in and mulching them with forestry mulchers? Is it kind of depending on if they're harvestable timber? Are you trying to thin out that way? Share some strategies that people could use depending on their context there.
Yeah, let me share a major caveat that we have not done
Okay.
any projects really where we're converting woods to a silvopasture. So the resources that I have are basically just as good as let's say um, I don't have the firsthand experience. So a book like Silvopasture by Steve Gabriel, highly recommend because that book talks more about the conversion of woods to a silvopasture setting. Great resource on that. And it really all depends on your context, right? Like if you have saleable timber, you might be able to make this profitable enough for a logging company to come in, take away some of the saleable timber, thin away some of your junk trees, and do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. It gets a whole lot more labor intensive if you have to do everything and you don't have saleable timber to offer as a carrot for a logger. But to the question of that was posed about multiflora rose and ash and having and using hogs. I've seen hogs used very, very effectively to get rid of really, really bad multiflora rose in particular, of woods that were just overgrown with multiflora rose. And pigs were brought in there and they really hammered it. And I don't know the details of how long and how many, but they were used quite effectively to get rid of the multiflora rose and open up that forest so that it could be reseeded and it could be made into a better pasture than it was previously. So it seems like they've got a good thing going on there.
Okay.
And if they have questions, I'd refer them to like a book called Silvopasture. And there's other folks like in New York. There's a forester named Brett Chedzoy that's also a really good resource on that.
Okay. Awesome. Andy's got a question. How often and how much should you water in the first year establishment? Context, we planted willow and poplar for coppicing for cow feed, taking inspiration from Trees for Graziers.
Nice. Again, it depends on the context. In our area, like I said, we don't water. If you're going to be running a very thick row, then it might make sense to set up like drip irrigation for the first year. I probably wouldn't after that, unless you're in a really, really dry area. Last year was the first year that we asked our clients to water the trees that we had just planted because we had this kind of strange 6-week drought. If I remember right, it was from like the beginning of May to halfway in June or something like that, where it just didn't drop. It didn't rain at all. And so we were really encouraging folks to get out there and water the trees because we hadn't been able to mulch yet. We were coming back around after our tree planting to do the mulch. So there was basically no moisture left in the soil when we were getting there. All the moisture was gone. There wasn't anything to conserve. Most of our clients were only able to get around once. And so we saw some minor losses, but for the most part, we did well. So all that to say, we don't irrigate very much. But if you are in an area where you are prone to long droughts, then it's probably a good thing to just water enough in the first year to get these trees established.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I'll echo that too, especially for our context. Like some years we've planted trees where we got lucky and we didn't need to irrigate and it was great. And there's other years where it doesn't rain and we're hand watering 1,000 trees. So my motto now is like, whatever trees I'm going to plant, I have all the systems and the infrastructure ready to go whether I'm using drip or big gun sprinklers or whatever, so that I can water them. And then if I don't have to, it's a bonus.
Right. Yeah.
You don't want to put out that many trees and then just have them die. It's
no, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Nick says, is silvopasture achievable in the desert? And if so, or should those trees be thorny or poisonous, or should those trees be a source of food by protected by fencing?
I would love to see silvopasture in the desert. It's going to look very different though, right? Because deserts are landscapes that don't typically support trees. Mesquite is kind of an exception. So mesquite is a quite common tree in, let's say, a lot of Texas. It's a very robust, low maintenance trees, and just about every region has trees that can grow in those areas. And probably with a little bit of support, a little bit of human support and protection in those early years, you can get those trees established. Mesquite, similar to honey locust, is a tree that has a lot of upside. It can fix nitrogen. It has a high energy pod that it drops, but then it has thorns. So for honey locust, what we're working on is developing consistently genetically thornless honey locust that people don't have to be afraid of planting in their pastures. And that's something similar that I would look to for mesquite. I don't know if anyone's doing the work there, but there's millions and millions of acres that mesquite could be very well applied to in arid conditions. And so similar on like the African savanna, those are acacia trees are going to provide a similar role, and probably with a little bit of support, they can get established. The Spanish dehesa is also very dry, Mediterranean climate, and with a little bit of support and protection in those first critical years, you can get those trees established.
Yeah. Great. Which plants or flowers are good as cover crops, especially in the establishment phase, without taking too long to plant plants or seeds? And then she's also asking what is good for feeding cows. And I would second that question of just like, have you played around with putting like more support trees or support species around each tree so that they can be self-mulching, almost like a comfrey or a Jerusalem artichoke or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. We have not. I would love to play around with that, but that really would, for me, I would feel most comfortable doing that on my property. And without, having to convince a client to manage things a certain way. Right. So once I get to the spot where I have my own big, sandbox, as it were, to play in, then we'll start messing around with that kind of thing, and particularly like syntropic agroforestry, where we're adding a lot of different complexity, a lot of different species, and we're using like a lot of the biomass that's being grown on site, harvesting it, using that for mulch. I really look forward to doing that, but that's not in our work with most of our clients. Okay. I can't really address the cover crop side of things very well. But the trees that are good for feeding cows, happy to answer that. So the two species that we focus on the most for feed for cattle are honey locust and persimmon, because they're providing that high energy. And I'll note that for the most part in our area, we are not short on protein in our feed, right? So our cool season perennial forages have plenty of protein, and what's limiting milk production for our dairy clients is energy, especially for our clients who are grass-fed, where they're not able to use corn, they're not able to use grain for that energy supplementation. Their production is low because they're kind of low in energy, and it's allowed under grass-fed standards to use things like beet pulp and molasses. And so I think fruit should fit in quite well here, rather than being a starchy form of energy like corn is. It's like a fructose form of energy, so it's digested easier by livestock, and it's able to give that bump of feed energy that's able to offset the high protein in forages.
Yeah, and just to echo that point, like in drought years here in Alberta, and I've heard guys doing this in Australia. We've never done this because I think it's crazy, but guys will feed. You can give a cow like cardboard or straw and just molasses, and they can stay alive. It's the sugar that's really critical. Now again, we've never done that, but I know neighbors who have fed. They used to, I think it was in the 80s or something. Hay prices were really high, and so they sold or you could get a truck to come around and like just inject molasses into your straw bales, almost like a sugar-filled donut, and then you could just put those out in the pasture, and that was getting guys through the winter here when feed prices were really high. So yeah, to have these trees that are just dropping it from like manna from the heaven is just incredible.
That's crazy.
So we can't get persimmons to grow here, but what are some other alternatives? Like would apples, would pears?
Apples, I think, are a great option, and there's so much that you can do with apples too. And apples, like no one is afraid of apples. Everyone's familiar with them. And one thing that we're looking to do with apples is to graft them on standard rootstock. So we have like a taller tree, because most nurseries, even like ecologically minded nurseries, are grafting on smaller rootstocks. But for a silvopasture, we really want like a tall tree, something with really robust root systems. And then grafting onto them livestock or wildlife specific apple varieties. So rather than like dessert varieties, which most or even cider varieties that most people are going to be able to find, having stuff that you really don't care about what they look like, you really don't care about what they taste like to a degree. You just want them to be really low maintenance, really hardy, and are going to perform year after year. And be super resilient, low maintenance in your system.
Yeah. And are you aware of any apple varieties that have been bred to hold on to their fruit late into the winter, like that are cultivars? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a great place, a great resource called Blue Hill Wildlife Nursery. And they're just a little bit north of us, very different context than what would be for you in Alberta. But they have a great a chart on their website where they have, it's a drop time chart. So for persimmons and pears and plums, but then also apples, they have this cultivar will drop during this time of the year, and this one will drop over. And so they'll cover like everything from very early, like August or September, all the way to December, November. Or December, January, February. And what they're doing a lot of is what they call apple crabs. Okay. So these are crab apples that are then hybridized with regular apples. And so they have the very low maintenance ease of crab apples with a little bit more of the size that you get from a domesticated apple.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wow. This is a fantastic resource. Holy cow.
Yep. So this is just one instance of a nursery that's going out there. They're not only doing the propagation, but they're going out there and going out and finding trees in the wild that are producing really well and producing regularly, and then they're making those available to the public.
Yeah, that's so cool.
I want to see a lot more of that happen in the future, and make it. And what they're doing for wildlife in particular translates very well into livestock.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. I had to. I love one of the roadkill crab. That's cool. Are there any other? I know we've mentioned like mulberry, willow, poplar, honey locust, apples, pears. Are there any other really kind of interesting species oak that we haven't really talked about, or that are up and coming?
That covers most of them. Let's say chestnut is another interesting one, especially as American chestnut becomes available over time. I really want to see silvopasture be able to establish a lot of American chestnuts out in pastures for combination of timber, for a really, really nice tall shade tree. You get the nuts, and then it's also just a great story, a great means of reintroducing this long lost tree. So that's one that I'm excited for in the years ahead. Black walnut is an interesting one for timber. There's a number of timber species that are interesting. There's a great book called Heartwood by a gentleman named Rowan Reed. He's down in Australia. It's one of the best books that I've ever come across on timber production, and he's specifically coming from the perspective of a forester who's planting trees into pastures. And he's coming at it from the perspective of, let's try to grow high quality timber in our pastures but then also creating like a diversity of trees where we're not just putting a timber plantation, a pine plantation into our farms. It's a beautifully done book, and a lot of great insight in that book, Heartwood by Rowan Reed.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Chris is he's been throwing all these links in the chat as well, folks, if you want to see those. So that's fantastic.
Great. Another one that I'm curious about is called yellowbud hickory or bitternut hickory. It grows. It's a very wide range of the country that it grows, and it's an interesting tree because the nuts can be pressed for oil. So I know a number of folks like Sam Thayer, who's a big forager, have been using this. It's really just like a really, 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 really small cottage industry at this point. Cottage pre-industry. So it's like smaller than a cottage industry. But it's a really kind of fascinating option for a North American olive oil alternative that can be grown on. There's a really large geography where it can just thrive. And I think it would integrate pretty well in a silvopasture setting where it's low maintenance tree. Even if it doesn't end up being a profitable tree crop, you still have a really high quality timber and firewood and a nice shade tree and a lot of ecological diversity that comes around when you're planting hickories. So that's one that I'm curious about. And then I would say if you have some space and you want to plant it on a homestead, like that could be a really valuable means of like providing all of your own like culinary oil.
Totally, yeah. Well, and I know Mark Shepard's been doing some really cool stuff, like you said, with chestnuts, but also hazelnuts. I think he's marketing hazelnut finished pork and just doing phenomenal with that. Yeah, he's based out of Wisconsin, so cool.
Yeah, hazelnuts is a species that we haven't gotten into so much because it, like for cattle in particular, it's just not quite big enough. Like I want trees that are going to be tall and provide shade and are going to be easy to integrate cattle with, whereas a shrubbier plant is going to be more something like a hazelnut is going to be more something that I want for hogs or for poultry. And because we haven't gotten into a lot of those systems yet, it's something that's a little bit on the back burner for us yet.
Yeah, totally. Okay, are you good to? There's a few more questions that just came up on YouTube. Are you good? Okay. We got one here. Do you manage the dropped honey locust pods, or do they easily decompose here up north?
So you don't want them to decompose. You want your livestock to pick them up off the ground before they break down. But the really nice thing about honey locust pods is that they will stay good for several months, even on the ground. Especially if you're further up north and you have consistent freezing conditions, those pods will stay better than if you, like around here, we often have freeze thaw. Or if you have muddy conditions, then you're going to get into more trouble than if you have nice, firm, solid ground, or if you have like a thick layer of stockpiled forages. That's kind of the ideal. And if they're dropping in November, December, January, you have time to get your livestock to move through the farm once or twice yet and eat up that stockpiled forages and then eat up the honey locust pods while you're going. And that's kind of the ideal scenario that I envision for honey locust pods, is that you're stockpiling your forages and then the pods drop and are a significant addition to that stockpile.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to find, you mentioned it in one of your articles that was included in your book, but I think it was like one tree you harvested. Do you remember how much it was? It was like
700 pounds.
700 pounds of, there it is. I just got to show this. It's
So
just,
the feed bag.
yeah, it's just phenomenal. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, you can get a lot of pods off of a tree. Now that was an interesting thing about honey locust pods is there was 700 pounds, probably well over 700 pounds of pods that year. And then the next year it didn't yield anything.
yeah, totally.
And then the year after that, it was really, really heavy again.
Totally.
But thankfully, it seems that honey locusts don't all sync up. Like oaks will often all sync up and yield really heavy in one year and then not the next.
Yeah,
Whereas
totally.
it seems that honey locust, it's more of an individual tree that will go heavy or low. There's a couple of trees that I've observed that have yielded really consistently 3 years in a row. So there's a lot of nuance to be figured out there. And something that I'm really looking forward to is when we actually have like agronomy around these tree crops, more than just the idea of we can use these trees and they're going to be good in a silvopasture, but where we get to the point where we actually know how to really use these trees effectively and know which cultivars are going to work well and that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, we've done enough with corn and soy. Let's leave that alone for a few years and focus on this. Well, this is just another fantastic chart from your book. Is like, you can get, average 5,000 pounds per acre of hay, but like you can get an additional, 3,600 pounds of those honey locust pods with the hay, and you'd probably get more hay out of it too.
Or forages. We're probably not going to hay that, but we're going to probably get as much or more forages off of it. And then the thing about the honey locust pods is that they're high in energy. So they're, calorically, they're significantly denser than the hay would be, right?
Yeah. Okay. Another question here, Austin: Are sheep eating these locust pods, or would you say goats might be taking them more readily? Thanks.
I don't have the experience to be able to compare those two species, but yes, they will both eat them quite readily. Some people have reported that they've fed honey locust pods to sheep or goats or cows, and that they haven't eaten them. And what I've found is that, well, a couple things. One is there's a wide range of variety in the quality of different pods. So some pods you break them open, and it's like they're dry, they're thin, there's not a whole lot to it. When you send them in for a forage sample, they might still be 15, 20% sugar, which sounds like a lot, but they don't. When you look at it, there's not a whole lot in there. Whereas trees that are selected for high sugar, like you can crack them open and you can squeeze out the sugar. Like it actually comes out kind of like a pudding or molasses. It's fantastic. And you can, like, I'll take a bite of those, and it's very sweet, very pleasant. And what I'll do is, if I'm able to feed those, what I'll do is I'll squeeze out some of the pulp. I'll put that on the outside of the pod, and I'll throw it over to the livestock. And that way, once they eat it, because the shell, the outside is pretty dry and bland, and it's not very inviting. But if you have a little bit of that sugar on the outside, they get a hit of that, and they pretty quickly figure out what's up.
Totally, yeah. Cool. We've got another question from Tori Van. We are from Missouri, and cut down trees in thick forest, leaving white oaks and pine, wanting to build soil from clay. Could cover crops also be implemented? I guess that doesn't really. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. I'd say probably if you want a lot of biology, you probably, and I'm no grazing expert, but from what I pick up, probably what you want to do is you want a lot of biological activity going, probably some fairly long rest periods, and then hit it really heavy with high densities of livestock. If you're needing to build soil and you've got clay, like hitting it with really high densities of livestock, maybe even doing some bale grazing over the winter. I have some clients that have converted forests over to Silvopasture. And what they've said is that the thing that made the most difference in getting their land to actually produce forages really well was bale grazing and putting a lot of fertility, a lot of impact in there, and then like in the hay bales, like you're putting a lot of grass seed in there too. And that was the thing that made the most difference, even above like spreading a chicken manure and spreading lime. It was that bale grazing. So it's just a lot of biology being pumped into that system.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll second that. That's been the biggest improvement we've seen on our land of all the different things is for sure bale grazing. The other thing I would mention here is like if you were kind of cutting down and mulching these trees, sometimes just that massive release of carbon just from the wood chips, it can, farmers here, they call it makes the soil go sour for a couple of years. And so, you might have challenge in growing anything for a year or two, but that's where what really is happening is there's just way too much carbon in the system and it's just absorbing all the nitrogen and there's not enough for any plants to grow. So that's where, again, that bale grazing, getting lots of animal manure in there would help to kind of charge up that excess carbon and get things going. But once it does start to grow, things just take off and it's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, and the livestock are probably also going to be integrating that carbon a little bit better. They're going to be stomping it in and just mixing things up through their hoof action.
Yeah. Okay, Austin, that's all the questions that we have from the audience. But I've got one more for you. So if you could go back, I think you said you started planting trees in 2017. You started doing trees into pasture in 2020. If you could go back to that time. You had 30 seconds to tell yourself, a few things. What advice would you give yourself before you got sucked back into the time machine?
That's a great question. Let's see here. One, I would tell my younger self, take it slow, take it steady, because this will take off. There will be more support for it. I think my first planting that I did, I tried to do as much of the farm as I could, get as much trees in the ground as possible. And now we've gone to a much more measured approach where we say, look, let's do this planting in phases. There's plenty of time. We just want to make sure that we're continuing to move forward. But once we put the tree in the ground, it's going to be there for a long time. So let's do this. Let's start off really small. Like I said, 10 trees the first year, just get your experience with it. And then year two, let's do another a little bit larger planting. And then let's take a year or maybe two off, see what we like, see what we don't like, maybe take some time to go out and get some resources. Also just like wait around for better genetics to be out there and better tree material, because right now we just don't have a lot of really high quality tree material, some of this silvopasture specific stuff. And that's something that we're working pretty hard on. Is just getting better tree material out there. And I know a lot of people are out there working on this. So I think a slow and steady and patient approach is going to be, we're working with trees, right? So working at the pace of trees is super valuable. And just knowing that we're going to work at this year in and year out, little by little, and make this something that really fits my farm, my property is the best advice that I have for my younger self and then for other people as well.
Fantastic, man. Austin, thanks so much for coming on the YouTube live tonight. Thanks for all the work that you do. Love your stuff. Again, folks, all of Austin's links are in the show notes below. Make sure you check them out. We'll see you around, man.
Thank you, Takoto. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on here.
Okay, take care.
Cool.